of Egyptian girls and women who were subject to female genital mutilation. That is down from over 90%. So my question is, considering the tremendous influence that the Muslim Brotherhood has now in Islamic forces, do you think that there might be an Islamic approach to continuing this battle against FGM rather than just using a human rights approach, which might not be as effective now? And also on other issues, including the minimum age for marriage, many other kinds of issues, looking at sort of an Islamic feminist approach to trying to fight for women's rights. And anyone who wants to answer.
Well, I think that's a very good point. It's actually one that predated the revolution. I think that's a very good point, and it predated the revolution. One of the big strategic debates among women's rights advocates on FGM was, and on actually many women's rights issues, is should we approach it from an international law perspective, and should we be pushing Egypt to meet international law standards and try to shame them into not joining the global community and et cetera, and being outcasts, or should we be pushing it through Islamic law principles? The second one, in my opinion, is more effective in Egypt. But there's people who disagree. It's not the one that I may personally adopt, but I think strategically it's the most effective because every study has shown, and my experience has at least corroborated it, that it is a highly religious society. It's a highly pious society. It's not Saudi Arabia style religious where you've got kind of a fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of Islam, but it's highly devout, and so religion is a key part of their life. So I think that I'm actually less worried about FGM because there have been so many religious opinions that have established, and most, at least educated Egyptians agree, that it is not an Islamic practice. And in fact, one could interpret Islam as banning it. But it definitely is not mandatory. There's a consensus on that. So I think there's a lot of room there to work within that framework, but I just want to note that I don't think the revolution, I don't think the Brotherhood being in power has changed that issue. As far as other laws, I think it's going to be a little more difficult. Things like divorce, definitely things like inheritance. I think there's going to be other issues that it's not going to be as easy, and the Brotherhood being in power may exacerbate that if you're coming from a progressive liberal perspective.
I'm just going to add a little bit to that. If you look at the 2000 debates over the personal status code that we were talking about, well, Sahar and I a few minutes ago, where women were granted, for the first time, no-fault divorce. The interesting nexus that happened where women, feminists and Islamists were coming together and saying, this is an Islamic principle. Women were guaranteed divorce through religion. And so it was an interesting moment where the feminist movement in Egypt, or activists, that's just, it's a 15-year struggle, but towards the end, when they got a lot of religious edicts in their favor, saying, yes, in fact, we are going to articulate our rights through the religious framework. I'm not going to say it got lots of popular support, but it did work to a certain extent. In terms of FGM and women's health, education especially, there are moments when you see on, and again, they're anecdotal, we don't have data on this, where clerics will come on TV and say, you know, the right of women to get education is guaranteed by the Quran. The right of women to their sanctity of their body is part of Sharia. And so you do see this. Is this the sphere and the mechanism that I think you're arguing that could be the strategy to finally abolish this? I would say yes. And it's not a new thing, like Sahar is saying. This has been a strategy of many people, and Professor Leila Abdul at Columbia has been talking about this in terms of Bedouin women for decades. And Margot Badran here in American University has been articulating this Islamist feminist perspective, which is not a rewriting of religious interpretation, but the implementation of religious interpretation. So in many ways, absolutely. But I think it's independent of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think we should be putting all of our eggs in one basket when we say it is them. Now that they're in power, they need to do this. I actually would prefer that they didn't. I would prefer that this is a social reform that begins at the grassroots and that the government protects the ability for this to happen. But for the government to say, or this movement to say, because we now redefine it as such, it should be, I'm actually not comfortable with that either. They should support it, but we should not wait for them to articulate it.
Thank you very much. And just thank you for this outstanding film.
Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Sahar, and first of all, I want you to know that I had the honor to have a brief conversation with Barack Obama in 2008 in Pennsylvania, where he shared with me not to depend on what he can do once he's elected president, to depend on what we do to support him, because he's not being elected to be the king, the czar, or the dictator. He's elected to be our leader, and our leader is only as strong as the people that are standing behind him to enforce his leadership. So that's a very important point. Judge Braeman, I would like to thank you for saying that it is not, I mean, it's, I wrote it down, so I won't forget, but that it's, that power is the ability to get things done. And we women here in the United States have demonstrated our power, our ability to get things done, but we need to reach across the ocean to other women. If you haven't seen the film Half the Sky, you need to see it. But and they had it here last year, but if you didn't see it, you need to see that. The question that I have is that and one last thing, that personal, they said that personal status is separate from the law. And in this community and other communities, I see all people separating themselves from people they don't want to identify with, instead of looking at their situation and helping them to be where we want to be, because that's where they want to be too. Now my question is, in the mosque, men go to the mosque and women stay home. That's a basic separatism right there. And if the communities are going to get together, what can be done about that situation? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a similar Barack Obama story, but I'll keep it for another day. For this question, I feel the need to take off my blazer, because mosque reform is something that's very important to consider modern context and the evolution of mosques. I won't take us through Ottoman history, but I will give us a brief understanding of what the mosque is, so we can understand what it's not. What it is and what it was at the birthplace of Islam was when the Prophet came and entered into a space where he said, remember, before Islam came, girls were buried alive. Women had, forget rights, we're talking about they were not equally human, right? The same way slaves were not equally, women were not equally human in this pre-Islamic Arabian society. So when the Prophet comes and says, here is this space called the mosque, where everyone has a space and a voice, in many ways we think that this is the first democratic space. It was a place where you didn't come just to worship, but you came to know the affairs of the day and discuss the affairs of the day. That is what the mosque is supposed to be. What it has become is something a bit different. What it has become overseas is also different in many countries. And what it is here in the United States is also something very different. So I'm not going to go through all the differences, but to say that the mosque is a space where men go to pray is antithetical to Islam. I'll say it and someone can argue with me later. It's antithetical to the spirit of Islam that determined that the mosque was not a gendered space. It was not a gendered space, it was not an economic space, it was not a space for different races, for separate races. It was a space for all persons. And you entered if you were human. And everyone was human. And so the articulation of what the mosque has become is a completely separate subject. In the Middle East, especially in a place like Egypt, the space of the mosque and the religious institutions that we're talking about, places like Al-Azhar, were a construct of the modern state system. When states came into birth, religion was relegated into these institutions and only into these institutions. So in many ways, putting the Western secular model, French secular model in some aspects, on a lot of these countries was a product of the birth of the modern nation state. And so ultimately what happens is that religion becomes relegated on gender terms in the creation of the new modern state, especially in a place like Egypt. And religion becomes relegated institutions, and over time they become controlled by the state. And so we need to understand the historical trajectory that leads to a space where women are excluded from religious participation and relegated to doing it in their homes. And so that, again, is part and parcel of the things that we need to rethink in what I kind of alluded to earlier, in these religious institutional reforms.
Actually, I would like to contribute to that, because this is a really crucial issue, and I've been living in Egypt for 2 years, and I have witnessed the transformation of women's space in the mosque, and how that's significantly declined and become more difficult. So in Egypt, I want to mention this because it's very important, because political participation is nothing without spiritual empowerment, especially in a society where religion plays such a central role in women's lives and in society. Most recently, and I've talked to many Egyptian judges and lawyers and imams in Egypt, there has been a lot of controversy because, firstly, by Egyptian law, the local municipal councils, women are banned from the mosque, entering the mosque, the major mosque, after dark. Okay? And in the most recent years, with the increase of more conservative imams on these local municipal councils, women's space has become more confined in the mosque. Now, we have to keep in mind that Egypt is a central place beside Mecca for religious pilgrimage to visit very famous women saints like Sayyidah Zainab, that is, Sayyidah means the title. She is the granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and many others who were buried in Egypt from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Very powerful women saints in Egypt that are revered, but yet women have no space in these mosques. And this was a part of the revolution. I sat with many women who not only they fought for political rights, but also the fact that they cannot enter the mosque after dark. The doors are shut in their faces. They can go to a nightclub, they can go to a hookah bar, but they can't go to a mosque. So this is a really important issue that women are dealing with right now in Egypt. So I had to contribute to that, to share my experience.
Hi, I'm Daud. I helped create and then later managed a USAID project that increased the women's access to family courts and mediation centers. I have a couple of questions, one for Dalia, one for Sahar, that relate to things that haven't been directly mentioned today, that I think affect the lives and political participation of women. First, the Constitution has not provided a significant emphasis on decentralization and has not created a space for women to participate effectively at the local level. I'm wondering if, Dalia, you could talk about the potential for either constitutional amendment or some type of legal remedy that might at least provide increased access to women at the local level, and, well, men as well. But secondly, dealing with the police. Now, while the police have not been on the side of citizens, they've basically been defenders of the regime. As you know, the police have basically withdrawn from whatever their duty was after the revolution, increasing the amount of criminality in society. I met with some women's legal defense NGOs who talk about the fact that in the face of gender violence, that women have absolutely no access to police to provide reports, And I just was wondering, Sahar, if you might be able to talk about the potential for police reform, either through legislation or through some type of implementation of existing law.
So I think the first part of your question was about decentralization of authority from the core to the periphery. In terms of long-term objectives, absolutely. But we saw the end of an authoritarian regime that was deeply entrenched just 2 years ago. What is the time span for democratic reform? All the literature tells us a pretty long time, and it will get worse before it gets better. And so, yes, is that the long-term objective? Yes, every government should have equal amounts of independence and also being part of the system. Do they? Yes. Do they technically? Is it representation? Absolutely. Is it effective representation? Again, all of this is new. All of this is new, and I think we can argue that the fact that even people like Salafists, and I'm not going to use them as a derogatory term, right, because there's also an array. If even they have accepted, as literature tells us, that democracy is the only game in town, we're ahead of the game already. Because we're not looking for toppling of these established norms of what the future will look like. In terms of police and reporting, sure, if we remember, why did the revolution begin? It's because Khalid Said was posting things about police abuse. And the Facebook page, we are all Khalid Said, the young internet cafe owner who was bludgeoned to death by the police for actually posting these reports. It was for police reform. In terms of harassment of women, well, yeah, sure, the police weren't doing much about it, maybe even joining in. What did women do? They started, I forget what it's called, but it's like a harassment locator. So you harass map, so you identify, this is a place where I've been harassed. So there's this huge harass map where people are taking this on their own, just like after the revolution, people were controlling and patrolling their own streets, right? Women took this upon themselves. We're not being protected, we'll protect each other. Does the state have to respond? Absolutely, because it's all documented, right? It's an app on your phone. And so there are these alternatives, and these alternatives will result in the state having to respond to it. The revolution's only 2 years old. And again, just like Jack Snyder and Columbia says, it is a very unstable road. And although we hold today Spain as the model of democratic transition, Spain was not the coolest place to be for a long time. So that we need to be aware of.
I would just note that most of the absence of crime in a society tends to be more from voluntary compliance than coercive enforcement. There is never enough resources to coercively enforce everyone. So much of it is cultural indoctrination and norms and values, and having more law and order shows where you idealize and respect the police and do whatever they tell you. So part of the solution, at least with security, because right now there is a major security deficit in Egypt, which I'm not sure if they're still playing this game, but we all know that when the police were reprimanded and criticized, rightfully so, for abusing citizens, and essentially the people fought them during the revolution, they said, okay, you don't like us? Fine, we're just going to disappear. And it was a really coercive method to show them, it's either us or the criminals. What do you want? A strong arm tactic. Obviously, the choice shouldn't be between those two extremes. So there is still a question as to whether the increase in crime right now is part of the police essentially purposefully not doing their job or other factors. But I think the police reform issue is a really complicated one, because you've got the Ministry of Interior and trying to get them to stop being so repressive from the top down. You've got the relationships. It's a whole culture of violence even within the police. But ultimately, if you really want to be preventative, it might help to get some of these young folks some jobs. so that they have something to do other than either petty theft or harassing women on the street. But that's not the panacea, because there is a cultural transition that needs to happen. And I'm glad you brought up harassment, because I think that's where the future is in changing Egyptian society. Is think of yourself as an American libertarian. You know, libertarians' attitude is small government, small government. Government does nothing but take my money and do nothing or perform incompetent tasks. And so to them, the solution is all in either private sector, voluntary organizations, but it is in the individual. It is extra-governmental. And I think in Egypt, there's a lot of that can be used to the citizens' advantage if there's mobilization. Now, of course, the problem is, will the government then try to suppress that, but which is what Mubarak did with the NGO sector. But I think the women have been much more effective in some of these campaigns, and they're bringing in a lot of the young men, and they're spray painting "I am a harasser" on their back. Oh, it's gotten really, really fast, really creative and bold. And the guys will be on motorcycles, and they're wearing like a yellow jacket, and they literally are on the prowl for harassers, and they shame them. And so this is a cultural transition. And then with that, it goes on Twitter, it goes on Facebook, it's got the harass map. Those are the types of creative ideas that need to happen. And the state isn't going to stop it, because first, their first response is, well, if you'd like, I'd be happy for you to arrest them and deal with them, but you're not. So in some ways, I'm doing you a favor. So I think it's a different way to look at it. The decentralization issue, it's a bit disappointing. We were hoping that the Constitution would decentralize things a bit. It didn't. The only thing I have to say about that, because that really is a dissertation, is keep in mind, this is the way that I view the Brotherhood. They are part of the old system. They were the losers in the old system. But they are not newcomers. The youth, for example, were not part of the old system, the revolutionary youth. That's not to say that I think they're qualified to govern Egypt by any means, but when you interpret how the Brotherhood is behaving, don't interpret everything through Islamism. Because it's not as much about Islamism and them being Islamists as it is about them being part of the old system, but being the losers, and now they're the winners. And are they going to have the capacity to create a new system when they have been indoctrinated and raised and nurtured in the old system, which is, as we say, bigderea, with your elbow. That's how you deal, you know? So we have to get out of that system. So so that's why I'm not surprised they didn't decentralize, because that would be a change in the system itself, as opposed to a change in just who's sitting in which chair.
Hello, my name is Helen Blackrock. I have a couple of comments and questions. First, I think the presentations here were outstanding. Really appreciated it. Second, I have great admiration for the women in Egypt who have been participating in large numbers in the protests despite the harassment and the pressure and culture. I think that's terrific. One other thing that's occurred to me as you talk about change, I've worked in international development in several, including in Muslim majority countries, and not worked in Egypt, but went there at one point, semi-official role, talking to various government people. And I've always, several times I heard the comment, basically, well, we're the people who built the pyramids, and we do things very slowly, you have to recognize that. Well, things seem to be moving a little more quickly now. My question, I guess, primarily for Professor Fahmy, but happy to hear from others. It was encouraging to hear that the Constitution isn't all bad for women, and isn't that. But I wonder then the basis of the protests against the Constitution and what the regime's been doing, are they more on the basis of the actual Constitution, or the way that it was rushed through and not much opinion presented? And as sort of an adjunct to that, you talked a little about the role of and sounded a bit like Iran, which was troubling. I wonder if are they really supposed to play a definitive role in interpreting things, or is it much more low-key?
You mean Sahar?
Do you want me to answer this question?
Well, yeah.
Oh, okay,
No,
right.
I said that before. I was correcting you because you talked about the Constitution, but anyone else who wants to take it on.
Right. Well, with regard to Al-Azhar, with regard to the first question, which was, were the disputes about substance, or were they about process and procedure? They were about both. And every time they lost on the process and procedure early on, which was first the shortage or inadequate representation of women, Copts, and liberal parties. There was 50 or over 50% of Muslim Brotherhood, and then you add the Salafis were generally right of the Brotherhood on the political spectrum. And so cumulatively there was, I don't know, 65%, 70%, which reflected the parliament, the first parliament. So that was a critique of this is flawed by design. And this is going to produce a very conservative document. Now the response was, well, it's pretty much representative of the country if you think that the elections were fair. And then there's a big debate as to that. But most people haven't challenged the validity of the election outcome. In the Brotherhood, this is a bit of an aside, but there's a consensus that the Brotherhood won that many seats, and the Salafis as well, because they were the most organized. And it was really more of an organizational superiority as opposed to just a representational reflection of the country. So there is a debate as to that, and the veracity of that contention is going to be tested in future elections if the liberal parties actually really do get their act together and get organized, because then we'll really know, is this a reflection of the country, or is it just a reflection of the incompetence and lack of preparation of the liberals, which is two different things. So yes, there was an underrepresentation of the liberal parties. There was also, they did push it through because the Supreme Court was going to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. The Supreme Court put Morsi in a corner, and it was a game of chicken, and Morsi won. Because they dissolved the parliament, and on December 2nd they had before them whether the Constituent Assembly was constitutionally created, and there was a lot of rumors that they were going to dissolve it, which would have set the process back months, and would have allowed Morsi to then have to recreate a new Constituent Assembly, which he didn't have the authority to do, but that was going to restart the initial debates about the process of who gets on. So it was going to push things back at least 2 to 3 months minimum. And he wanted stability. He wants to move on. He wants to get to the elections. He's got a major economic crisis on his hands. I'm being, kind of charitable to his regime right now. But that was his perspective, and so he just decided unilaterally, okay, I'm above the law. Whatever the Supreme Court says is not binding, and this is an interim declaration the way the military did, and since I'm the legislative and executive branch, I'm just going to just delegitimize the judiciary. So it was, from a rule of law perspective, it was pretty illegitimate. But he felt that he had no other choice, and then he pushed it through, and the Egyptian people, frankly, were so fed up and so fatigued and so ready to move on that they just said, fine, we put up with 30 years of dictatorship, we'll put up with this, let's just go vote on the referendum. And the judiciary now he said, I'm going to back off after all the pressure. He said the interim declaration is only applicable until the referendum passes, or until there's a vote, and it passed as everyone expected it would. And so you've got it. But, that was the process, which was really flawed. But it's also, as Dalia said, a really difficult transition, and these are not ideal circumstances. And there is something to be said about Egypt moving on and not falling off the fiscal cliff. Because it has a serious financial crisis as far as the foreign currency concerns. They're almost over. So if you think it's bad now, and he's the president, and if he has any sense of ethics or obligation, he's got to deal with that responsibly. So, but content, yes, there was content, and some of it I had discussed. But my comments were stepping back and saying, at the end of the day, this is a constitution. Some of the substantive differences were, in my opinion, things that really should be in a constitution. They were very detail-oriented, they were very detailed, and they can still be solved in law. The difference, of course, is in statutes you've got a parliament as opposed to the population voting on a referendum. You have to decide, do you think you've got a better chance of making significant changes through a constitutional referendum that's voted by people who, many of whom really don't understand constitutions very well, including people in this country if we had one. I don't think most people would really know the implications of all the provisions. Or would you have it by parliament that's dominated by one particular party? So it's kind of a rock and a hard place. But I guess I'll just end to say, I'm still optimistic that as long as the democratic process is still moving, as long as Morsi and his regime don't play it dirty the way that every other former regime has done, and essentially change the rules such that it is nearly impossible for any political party to ever dominate, and for them to ever remove either him or his someone after him from his party. So long as there's some space for change, then things will evolve, and they will start to be more representative of society.
Actually, I just wanted to contribute one thing to that, because you mentioned about Al-Azhar and the new rule in the government. Because I had the opportunity to meet with Sheikh Al-Azhar, and I spent time most recently on the Al-Azhar campus in downtown Cairo. And I wanted to mention some really important things. There's a lot of internal divisions within Al-Azhar. So Sheikh Al-Azhar, the Grand Sheikh of Azhar, is considered to be quite liberal, but there are also many conservative imams within that camp of Al-Azhar. For example, there are imams within Al-Azhar that actually support female genital mutilation and say that it's a part of the Sunnah, that is the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. And in fact, actually, the downtown campus of Al-Azhar is segregated for only males. And the female campus for Al-Azhar, so in the 80s, it was actually the same campus, downtown, which is the historical, beautiful campus. But now, women are an hour away in the Medina Nas, which is the Nasr City campus, which is highly, highly inferior. And I was actually appalled. This is actually what I spoke with the office of Sheikh Al-Azhar as to why women are on a separate campus. So, they say, in the old times, separate but equal, but in this case, it's separate but unequal. And in terms of the studies of fiqh al-Islam, like Islamic studies and so forth, there are different sets of programs for men and for women, and it's not equal. And as we know, Al-Azhar is one of the oldest, most respected institutions in the Islamic world. It's the oldest respected institutions of the world, actually, the first universities in the world. And most of the imams that come from Al-Azhar are considered to be the most prestigious, and they're the most respected for the Islamic knowledge, as Egypt and Cairo was the center of Islamic knowledge. But there is an influence from the outside, from the Muslim Brotherhood, from outside Islamist parties, and that's why you have even some of the imams, that's why I mentioned earlier about the local councils in Egypt, in which women's space has been increasingly diminishing in their presence in the mosque, and a lot of it has a connection with the imams. So their hands are not clean from these ideological divisions. So we have to be careful with this.
I'm Hanan of the Egyptian American. Dalia presented focus on the state targeting women with violence, while Sahar emphasized culture. And I would argue we can connect the two by saying that the best time for women progress in Egypt actually was when the state, through a strong authoritarian ruler like Nasser, was able to challenge actually the culture and the religious culture. So now, if I were to notch this up a little bit on this speech a little bit And let's call it back. I mean, the real problem is that the majority of Egyptian people, whether Muslims or Coptic, and I'm searching for the best word here, but maybe accept, or subscribe, or yield. I don't want to use the word believe, okay, but accept, subscribe, or yield a patriarchal, medieval interpretation of religion that is written by men, interpreted by men, and implemented by men. And that is really the real problem. And unless, unfortunately, the current government is, is in line with that. But unless there is a kind of a government that can challenge that, then there is a lot of concern for the future of women in Egypt. So I don't know if you have any comments, including Hanan, actually, since I. Thank you.
I will say one thing, that separate subject, there is a space for Islamic feminism, and it's in many ways the re-articulation of faith. And there is a space for Egyptian feminism that is culturally, historically, documentally entrenched in Egyptian society. Egyptian women's literacy was much higher than it is today. Egyptian women in the public was much higher than it is today. Egyptian women in university and social activism was much higher than it is today. And so we're dealing with the conditions of the day. In terms of the Muslim Brotherhood, we're treating them like a monolith, right? It's, what are you holding, the elephant's tail or the nose? No, you're holding the Muslim Brotherhood. No, you're holding this massive giant that is not a monolith. When we look at the debates on Al-Azhar that have been mentioned, this is not a new debate, right? In 2007, when the Muslim Brotherhood leaked their parliamentary platform, it was in there. And there was this was an international debate, right? Hamzawi was here in Washington before he went there, and this was one of the sticking points. And so we all went and debated there. What does this mean that Al-Azhar is going to be parallel to the Constitutional Court? And so this was part of my research. And so when I went to Cairo, asking specifically about the role of Al-Azhar, my question was very simple. The Egyptian Constitution, right, previously and until today, Article 2 is what? Sharia is the law of the land. And so if there's an Islamic reference in law, why do you need a religious court to give a religious stamp of approval the way the Constitutional Court will give a constitutional stamp of approval on laws? And so this is it's a duality in many ways. And so the answer was, this was a very highly contested thing inside of the Muslim Brotherhood. And after the draft was leaked, it was going to be retracted. The fact that it's come back now is a very interesting point of political concern, looking at the historical trajectory that has happened vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood and the state. And so we need to look at this in a wider scale. And that's why I'm very, I don't want to say uncomfortable, leery of us saying, it is them and they need to do it, because then we're going back into that pathology of authoritarian control over family. And so we can argue where patriarchy really is. But we need to be very cognizant of the ramifications of allocating the authority to change to a specific body. The history and legacy of Egypt is rich and large, and as an Egyptian, very great. But we need to understand that we need to have a multi-pronged approach to this moment. And so that, I think, is a better approach than saying it has to be through the very system that created the mess.
Well, just to comment briefly, I think also with our experience with the Valuable Girl Project is that working with the girl by herself in vacuum, away from her family, doesn't really have it actually is counterproductive, right? Because she goes back home to the values of the traditional family, to the father and the brother. So I agree with Dalia, it has to be a multi-pronged approach. You have to talk to the family, and then you have to talk to the individuals in the family, to the community. So, we should be careful not to replace one monster with another. Where in taming one monster, we are, unconsciously creating another. So,
Time for one more brief question.
Yes, my name is Sahar and my thanks to all the panelists who presented. Excellent presentation. I have a question for you, Dr. Asiya. It
since you have been in Egypt for the past 2-3 years, is there any hope for Egyptian women?
Is there any hope?
I'll try to make it brief, and I'll mention what I feel would be the best strategy for a more optimistic future for Egyptian women. And that is the inclusion of women from the NTB party and from the old regime. And let me tell you why very briefly. I feel, in my opinion, it was a very grave mistake for eliminating and ostracizing the women from the NDP party. Now, Suzanne Mubarak, the wife of Hosni Mubarak, was a very much controversial character. She was implicated in corruption with her husband, and actually in many cases instigating and really the backbone behind the corruption of the regime. However, she did make many progressive laws in Egypt for women. They were criticized, the women of the NDP party, for being elitist, and in many ways they were demonized by the Islamists because it was a class issue. Women from the NDP party were highly westernized. They lived in Western societies. Their children studied abroad. They were very wealthy. They had financial empowerment. And so they were the greatest fear of many men in Egypt who actually demonized the NDP party and also feared women's empowerment. So there needs to be a balance, right? So what they call falou, that is removing the remnants of the old regime, went too far. And, you know, we talked today about the status quo, the quota system in Egypt, in which in 2010 women held over 64 seats in parliament. Now, it was criticized, right, because, well, I want to mention that the most critical of this quota system was the Muslim Brotherhood. So actually the ones who benefited the most, the women who benefited the most from the removal of this quota system were Muslim Brotherhood women from the Freedom and Justice Party. Now that makes me question why. So the question is, was it better to have a quota system and then maybe have a disproportionate representation of NDP women, or to have no women at all? And now what we have is less than 2% of women in parliament, and a disproportionate representation of women from the Muslim Brotherhood Party, who many feel do not represent the diverse viewpoints of women in Egypt. So there needs to be a balance, and we need to sit at the table with all women from all sectors of society in Egypt, even women from the NDP party, because in the end, not all people from the NDP party were bad. It was just the only source of political power because the system was so corrupted, and everybody in the system benefited from corruption. I would like to make some final comments. I would like to thank the organizers of this program, that is Zainab Mansour. If you could stand up and Amin Mahmoud. And Nali Hassanein.
She's not here.
The Egyptian American, they're part of the Egyptian American Society in Washington. And I also wanted to make another comment that we will be going to have dinner at Kebab G. It's on Connecticut Avenue, if all of you would like to join us. Thank you.